There comes a moment in every human life when the very ground beneath our feet begins to shift, when the familiar rhythms that once carried us forward suddenly feel foreign and hollow. You wake one morning and realize that something fundamental has changed, not in the world around you, but in the very fabric of your being. The coffee tastes the same, the sun rises as it always has, yet you are no longer the same person who went to sleep the night before. This is the beginning of what I call the great weariness, a profound exhaustion that reaches far beyond the physical realm into the deepest chambers of the soul. This weariness does not announce itself with fanfare or dramatic revelation. Instead, it seeps into your consciousness, like water through stone, slowly and persistently, until one day you find yourself drowning in an ocean of your own making. You may have attributed it to stress, to the demands of modern life, to the endless cycle of work and responsibility that defines our contemporary existence. But if you listen closely, if you quiet the noise of the outer world and descend into the sacred silence within, you will hear something far more profound calling to you from the depths. The ancient alchemists spoke of a process they called the Nigredo, the blackening, the necessary descent into darkness that precedes all transformation. What you are experiencing is not a failure of character or a weakness of will, but rather the soul's wisdom manifesting itself in the only language it knows, the language of symbolic death. Your psyche, in its infinite intelligence, has recognized that the life you have been living is no longer sustainable, that the persona you have constructed so carefully over the years has become a prison rather than a protective shell. Consider the image of a candle burning in a windowless room. For years, perhaps decades, you have been that flame burning steadily, providing light and warmth to all who enter your sphere. You have drawn upon reserves of energy you didn't even know you possessed, giving of yourself freely and generously. But what happens when the wax begins to run low? What occurs when the wick grows shorter and the flame begins to flutter in the darkness? The candle does not choose to burn less brightly. It simply reaches the natural limits of its fuel. This is precisely what Jung meant when he spoke of the depletion of libido, the psychic energy that drives all human activity. You have been burning on borrowed fuel, drawing from wells that were never meant to sustain the elaborate performance of modern living. The persona, that carefully crafted mask we wear to navigate social expectations, requires tremendous energy to maintain. Like an actor who never leaves the stage, you have been performing so long that you have forgotten there was ever a time when you simply existed without the need for constant presentation. The great weariness manifests itself in ways that our rational mind struggles to comprehend. You find yourself going through the motions of daily life with mechanical precision, yet feeling utterly disconnected from the experience. Conversations that once energized you now feel like swimming through thick honey. Tasks that previously brought satisfaction now seem pointless and repetitive. You look around at others who appear to be thriving in this same environment and wonder what secret they possess that you have somehow lost. But here lies the great paradox that Jung understood so well. What appears to be loss is often the beginning of discovery. What feels like ending is frequently the commencement of transformation. The exhaustion you experience is not a sign that you are broken or insufficient. It is the soul's way of withdrawing its investment from activities and relationships that no longer serve your deepest purpose. Like a wise investor pulling funds from a failing enterprise, your psyche is conserving energy for something far more significant than the endless maintenance of an inauthentic existence. In the mythology of many cultures, we find the archetype of the wounded healer, the one who must first descend into their own darkness before they can guide others toward the light. Your weariness is not a curse, but a calling, not a punishment, but an invitation to embark upon the most important journey of your life. the journey back to your authentic self. The ancient Greeks had a word for this process: anamnesis, the unforgetting, the remembering of who you truly are beneath all the layers of conditioning and expectation. The soul operates according to laws that are entirely different from those governing the ego. While the ego seeks to achieve, to accumulate, to build ever more elaborate structures of security and identity, the soul is primarily concerned with meaning, with truth, with the authentic expression of your unique essence. When these two fundamental drives come into conflict, when the ego's agenda no longer aligns with the soul's purpose, the result is precisely this great weariness that you now experience. Think of it as your inner wisdom staging a gentle rebellion against the tyranny of unconscious living. Your psyche has grown tired of the constant effort required to be someone you are not, to want things you do not truly desire, to pursue goals that belong to others rather than yourself. Like a river that has been dammed for too long, the natural flow of your being seeks to break through the artificial barriers that have contained it. This is why no amount of rest seems sufficient, why vacations provide only temporary relief, why even the most indulgent self-care rituals fail to address the deeper exhaustion you feel. You are not tired in your body. You are tired in your soul. The very foundations of your identity have begun to crack under the weight of their own artificiality, and no external remedy can address what is fundamentally an internal crisis of meaning. Jung often spoke of the transcendent function, the psyche's innate ability to create new possibilities from seemingly irreconcilable opposites. Your weariness and your yearning for authenticity are not enemies but collaborators in the great work of individuation. The exhaustion is clearing away what no longer serves, creating space for what wants to emerge. Like a forest fire that destroys the old growth to make room for new life, your spiritual fatigue is a necessary clearing that precedes rebirth. As you sit with this great weariness, resist the urge to pathologize it or rush toward quick solutions. Instead, allow yourself to be present with the profound intelligence of your own transformation. Honor the courage it takes to acknowledge that the life you have been living may no longer be the life you are meant to live. This admission requires tremendous bravery, for it means facing the unknown territory of becoming who you truly are rather than who you think you should be. The great weariness is not your enemy. It is your ally in the sacred work of return. Return to yourself, to your truth, to the authentic expression of your being that has been waiting patiently beneath the surface all along. This is where your real journey begins. There comes a moment in the soul's journey when the morning light falls differently across your face, and you pause before the mirror, not in recognition but in bewilderment. The eyes that stare back carry the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths, yet they belong to a stranger, a being you no longer know how to name or claim. This is the first trembling of awakening, the initial crack in the crystalline facade of who you believed yourself to be. You have worn your persona like a perfectly tailored coat, stitched with threads of expectation and dyed in the colors others found pleasing. Day after day, you have stepped into this garment of identity, adjusting its collar, smoothing its wrinkles, ensuring it fit the shape others needed you to fill. But now, standing in the unforgiving honesty of reflected light, you see the costume for what it has always been, a beautiful lie, a necessary deception that has slowly consumed the one who wears it. The mirror does not lie, though we have taught ourselves to see through its surface, to somewhere safer, somewhere more familiar. But in this moment of recognition, the glass becomes a threshold between worlds, the world of who you have pretended to be, and the vast, unexplored territory of who you actually are. The reflection wavers like water disturbed by stones, and in that distortion, you glimpse something both terrifying and sacred, the shadow of your authentic self. This is not merely fatigue of the body, though the body carries its burden. This is the exhaustion that seeps into the very marrow of being when the soul can no longer sustain the weight of pretense. You feel it in your bones, this profound disconnection from your own image, as if you were an actor who has performed the same role for so many years that you have forgotten the sound of your own voice beneath the character's scripted words. The persona, that carefully constructed mask we present to the world, begins to crack like dried earth in drought. Each fissure reveals the darkness beneath, not the darkness of evil, but the darkness of the unknown, the unacknowledged, the unlived aspects of self that have waited in the wings of consciousness, like understudies never called to perform. This shadow material rises now, pressing against the weakening walls of your constructed identity, demanding recognition. You touch the glass, and your fingers meet their own reflection in a gesture both intimate and alien. The temperature of the surface shocks you, cold as winter stone, yet somehow alive with possibility. In this touch, you feel the electric current of transformation beginning to flow through your nervous system, awakening nerve endings that have long been dormant, stirring sensations that have no names in the vocabulary of your former self. The face in the mirror begins to shift and change, not in any physical sense, but in the quality of recognition that flows between observer and observed. You see now the careful architecture of expression you have built, the practiced smile that never quite reaches the depth of genuine joy, the eyes that have learned to deflect rather than invite, the mouth that speaks words chosen more for their safety than their truth. Every feature bears the mark of compromise, the subtle distortions that come from living at an angle to your own nature. But beneath this surface performance, something else stirs. In the depths of the reflected eyes, you catch glimpses of the wild thing that lives at your core, the untamed aspect of self that has been caged behind propriety, locked away behind the need to be acceptable, lovable, worthy in the eyes of others. This inner creature moves restlessly now, sensing the weakening of its prison bars, feeling the first breath of freedom in the cracks of your crumbling persona. The mirror becomes a confessional where the ego meets its shadow in a confrontation that leaves both changed. Here, in this liminal space between self and reflection, the careful boundaries you have drawn around acceptable thought and feeling begin to dissolve. The shadow material, all that you have disowned, rejected, or refused to acknowledge, seeps back into consciousness like water, finding its level after a dam has been breached. You see yourself now as you have never allowed yourself to be seen. The anger you have swallowed in service of peace, the desires you have buried beneath duty, the wild creativity you have tamed into acceptable forms, the raw truth you have polished into pleasant lies. Each recognition brings its own particular exhaustion, the fatigue of a warrior who has been fighting a war against himself without knowing it. The spiritual exhaustion manifests in your very cells, a bone-deep weariness that sleep cannot touch and rest cannot heal. It is the tiredness of the soul when it can no longer sustain the split between authentic being and performed identity. Your body carries this division like a fracture that has never properly healed, aching with the constant tension of holding opposing forces in uneasy balance. In the reflection, you begin to see the map of your own imprisonment, how you have learned to gesture without meaning, to speak without voice, to present without presence. The mirror shows you the accumulated weight of all the moments when you chose safety over truth, acceptance over authenticity, the approval of others over the approval of your own deepest knowing. Each choice carved another line in your face, another shadow in your eyes, another layer of distance between the self that lives and the self that dreams. Yet in this recognition, something profound begins to stir. The very act of seeing the persona for what it is creates the first space for something new to breathe. Like a seed splitting open in the dark soil of awareness, the possibility of authentic being begins to germinate in the composted remains of your former identity. The mirror that once reflected only the mask now becomes a window through which the true self might emerge. The stranger in the glass regards you with eyes that hold both compassion and challenge. This reflected being has been waiting patiently for this moment of recognition, knowing that only when the costume becomes unbearable does the actor remember there is someone beneath the role. The fatigue you feel is not failure. It is the soul's way of saying it is ready for something real, something true, something that matches the depth of what lives within you. This is the beginning of the great undoing, the necessary dismantling that precedes all authentic transformation. The mirror cracks not to destroy, but to reveal. The persona splits not from weakness, but from the pressure of something genuine seeking expression. The exhaustion you feel is the labor pain of a new self, struggling to be born from the chrysalis of who you used to be. In the reflected depths, you glimpse the outline of your own becoming, not the polished self you have tried to perfect, but the raw, unfinished, gloriously imperfect being that carries the seeds of your true nature. This is the self that knows your real name, the one whispered in dreams and felt in moments of solitude, when all masks fall away. This is the self that has been waiting beneath the performance, patient as earth waiting for spring, knowing that all personas eventually crumble before the relentless growth of authentic life. The mirror holds this moment like a jewel, precious, terrible, and absolutely necessary. In its cruel honesty, you find the first gift of transformation, the recognition that you are not who you have pretended to be, and in that recognition, the first breath of who you might actually become. The reflection trembles with possibility, and you tremble with it, standing at the threshold between the known self and the self that waits to be discovered in the depths of your own becoming. There comes a moment in the soul's journey when the very ground beneath our carefully constructed identity begins to shift like sand beneath our feet. We have walked so long in the costumes of others' expectations that we have forgotten the weight of our own skin. The second sign of transformation arrives not as a thunderbolt, but as a whisper that grows louder with each passing day, the whisper that speaks of exhaustion so profound it touches the marrow of our being. Listen closely, and you will hear it in the spaces between your breaths. That voice that says, "I cannot do this anymore." Not the cannot of temporary fatigue, but the cannot of a soul that has been asked to carry water in a basket, to maintain an illusion that was never meant to sustain the fullness of human existence. We have become actors in a play we never auditioned for, speaking lines written by invisible hands, performing for an audience whose approval we seek, but whose faces we cannot clearly see. The desert of endless performance stretches before us, vast and unforgiving. Here, in this wasteland of masks and mirrors, we discover that what we believed to be our strength, our ability to adapt, to please, to become what others need us to be, has become our greatest burden. Each social interaction demands another costume change, another voice, another way of being that serves everyone except the one who lives behind our eyes. Jung understood this desert well. He walked its burning sands and felt the scorching wind that strips away everything except what is essential. The persona, he taught us, is meant to be a bridge between our inner world and outer reality, a functional interface, not a prison. But somewhere in our journey, we confused the bridge with the destination. We began to believe that the mask was the face, that the performance was the truth of who we are. In this desert, we meet the ancient pilgrims who have walked before us. They appear as mirages at first, shimmering figures on the horizon of our consciousness. But as we draw closer, we see that they are real. The countless souls who have felt this same exhaustion, this same spiritual thirst that cannot be quenched by the applause of others. They carry within their eyes the same recognition that authenticity has become a foreign language, spoken only in dreams and in moments when we believe no one is watching. The exhaustion we feel is not merely physical, though it manifests in our bodies as tension that no massage can release, as a tiredness that no amount of sleep can cure. It is the exhaustion of the soul that has been asked to fragment itself into 1,000 pieces, each piece serving a different master, each piece singing a different song. We have become a choir of voices that never harmonize because they were never meant to sing together. Watch how we move through our days, and you will see the choreography of this performance. In the morning, we don the costume of the productive worker, our face arranged in expressions of competence and enthusiasm. By afternoon, we have transformed into the caring friend, the reliable partner, the dutiful child or parent. By evening, we are the social being, witty and engaging, hiding our hunger for solitude beneath layers of animated conversation. And in the small hours of the night, when all the costumes have been hung in their respective closets, we lie in our beds wondering who we might be if no one was watching, if no one needed anything from us, if we could simply exist without purpose or performance. This is the desert's cruelest gift. It shows us the distance between who we are and who we have pretended to be. In the harsh light of this awareness, every interaction becomes theater, and we find ourselves analyzing our own performance even as we deliver it. Am I being too enthusiastic, not enthusiastic enough? Are they buying this version of me, or can they see through to the emptiness I feel inside? The very act of being present with another human being becomes a carefully calculated dance, and spontaneity, that natural expression of the authentic self, becomes as rare as water in the wasteland. The desert teaches us that performance, when it becomes our primary mode of being, consumes resources we do not have an infinite supply of. Just as a car running on empty will eventually stop, no matter how beautiful its exterior or how skilled its driver, the soul that has been performing without rest will eventually refuse to continue the charade. This is not failure. This is wisdom. The unconscious mind, in its infinite intelligence, begins to withdraw its energy from the endless theater, leaving us feeling depleted and strange to ourselves. We begin to notice the subtle signs of this withdrawal. Conversations that once energized us now drain us completely. Relationships that were built on our ability to be what others needed feel hollow and unsustainable. The very activities that once brought us joy, if indeed they ever truly did, now feel like obligations we fulfill out of habit rather than genuine desire. We are like method actors who have been in character for so long that we have forgotten our original name, our original face, our original way of moving through the world. In this recognition comes a terrible and beautiful realization. We are homesick for ourselves. We are wanderers in our own life, seeking a place that exists not in the external world, but in the depths of our own being. The desert of performance has led us to this moment of truth, that no amount of external validation can satisfy the soul's hunger for authentic expression, for the freedom to be imperfect, incomplete, real. Jung called this the process of individuation, the gradual differentiation of the self from the collective expectations that have shaped us. But before individuation can truly begin, we must first acknowledge the extent to which we have lost ourselves in the maze of others' needs and desires. We must feel the full weight of the exhaustion that comes from living a borrowed life, from speaking borrowed words, from wearing borrowed faces. The ancient pilgrims who walk beside us in this desert whisper secrets of their own journey. They tell us that the exhaustion is not punishment but invitation, an invitation to lay down the burden of being everything to everyone, and to discover what remains when all the performances cease. They speak of the courage it takes to disappoint others, to fail at meeting expectations, to reveal the imperfect human being who has been hiding behind the flawless facade. Who would I be, they ask, if I stopped trying to be who I think I should be? This question echoes across the desert sands, carried by winds that have witnessed the transformation of countless souls. It is a question that has no easy answer, because it requires us to venture into territory we have spent years avoiding, the landscape of our own authentic desires, fears, and longings. The desert strips away everything that is not essential. Here, in this place of spiritual nakedness, we discover that authenticity is not another performance to master, but rather the absence of performance altogether. It is the courage to show up as we are, with our contradictions and confusions, our moments of grace and our moments of failure. It is the radical act of allowing others to see us, not as we think we should be, but as we actually are in this moment, in this breath, in this irreplaceable instant of being alive. But this desert crossing is not without its terrors. As we begin to release our grip on the familiar costumes of identity, we face the fear that without our performances, we might disappear entirely. If we are not the helpful one, the strong one, the successful one, the caring one, then who are we? This fear drives many back to the familiar exhaustion of performance, back to the safety of known roles and expected behaviors. Yet for those who continue walking, who allow themselves to feel the full weight of this spiritual thirst, the desert begins to reveal its deeper secrets. In the silence between performances, in the space where no one is watching and nothing is expected, we begin to hear something we had almost forgotten, the sound of our own authentic voice. At first, it is barely a whisper, so long suppressed that we mistake it for wind across the sand. But gradually, as we learn to listen, we recognize it as our own. This voice speaks not of what we should do or who we should be, but of what brings us alive, what makes our heart quicken with genuine interest, what moves us to tears not of performance, but of recognition. It is the voice that remembers what we loved before we learned to love what others wanted us to love. It is the voice that knows our true name, the one we had before the world began to call us by our functions and our roles. The desert of endless performance is coming to its end, but not because we have reached its geographical boundaries. It ends because we have finally learned to see it for what it is, a mirage that promised satisfaction but delivered only endless thirst. As we prepare to leave this wasteland behind, we carry with us the hard-won wisdom of exhaustion, that no external performance can ever substitute for the internal work of becoming who we are meant to be. The pilgrims who have walked this path before us offer one final gift as we prepare for the next stage of the journey. They remind us that the energy we have been spending on performance, that precious life force we have been pouring into the maintenance of masks, can be reclaimed and redirected toward the cultivation of authentic presence. The same creativity that went into crafting personas can be channeled into the sacred work of self-discovery. The same dedication that maintained facades can be offered to the patient, tender process of allowing our true self to emerge. As we take our final steps across the burning sand, we feel something shifting within us. The exhaustion remains, but it is no longer the exhaustion of futility. It has become the good tiredness that comes after honest labor, after choosing truth over comfort, after saying no to what diminishes us, so that we might eventually say yes to what makes us whole. We are leaving the desert of endless performance, but we are not leaving empty-handed. we carry with us the knowledge that authenticity is not a destination, but a way of traveling, not a performance to perfect, but a presence to cultivate, moment by moment, breath by breath, choice by choice. There comes a moment in the soul's journey when the familiar flames that once danced so vibrantly within us begin to dim, not through any external catastrophe, but through something far more mysterious, a withdrawal so profound that it feels like winter settling into the secret chambers of our being. You know this place, don't you? This gray twilight where passion recedes like tide from a forgotten shore, leaving behind only the memory of what once moved us to tears, to laughter, to that exquisite ache of being fully alive. This is the third manifestation of the soul's rebellion, and perhaps the most bewildering of all. For here, in this strange country of diminished fire, we discover that our essential self has begun to pull away from the very things that once defined us. The career that once sparked electricity in our veins now feels like moving through molasses. The relationships that once filled us with warmth now seem to require a performance we can no longer sustain. The dreams that once pulled us forward like magnetic north now appear as distant stars in a sky that has somehow grown too vast to navigate. But this is not the darkness of clinical depression, though it may wear similar clothes. No, this is something far more archetypal, the soul's conscious withdrawal from investments that no longer serve its deeper evolutionary purpose. Jung knew this territory well, this place where the psyche begins to divest itself of attachments that have outlived their usefulness, even when these attachments once brought us great joy. It is as if our innermost self, that wise hermit who dwells in the mountain cave of our unconscious, has begun to call us home from the marketplace of external stimulation. Listen carefully to this silence between heartbeats, for it carries within it the seeds of profound transformation. The ancient alchemists called this phase the Nigredo, the blackening, the putrefaction of what was once golden and bright. They understood that certain deaths must occur before certain births can take place, that the soul must sometimes empty itself completely before it can be filled with something more essential, more true. You may find yourself sitting in rooms full of laughter, feeling like you're watching life through layers of ancient glass. The jokes that once delighted you now seem to echo from a great distance. The music that once moved your body to dance now plays to ears that have somehow forgotten how to truly hear. The food that once brought pleasure now tastes like ash in a mouth that has grown weary of consuming what cannot nourish the deepest hunger. This withdrawal is not failure, it is wisdom. Your psyche, in its infinite intelligence, has begun to recognize that the wells from which you have been drinking have run dry, that the sources of meaning you have relied upon are no longer adequate for the person you are becoming. Like a plant that stops flowering when it senses winter approaching, your soul has begun to conserve its energy for the deeper work that lies ahead. In this gray landscape, you may discover that even your own thoughts have become strangers to you. The inner dialogue that once provided companionship now seems hollow, repetitive, like prayers recited by rote in an empty cathedral. Your mind, that faithful servant of your conscious will, begins to feel like a broken record player, cycling through the same worn grooves of worry, hope, planning, and remembering. The very act of thinking becomes exhausting, as if your consciousness has grown tired of its own voice. But beneath this surface exhaustion, something profound is stirring. The hermit in the cave of your unconscious is preparing for a pilgrimage that cannot be undertaken while you remain attached to the familiar fires of your former life. This withdrawal, this gray winter of the soul, is actually a gathering, a pulling inward of all the scattered energies you have invested in external pursuits, relationships, and identities that no longer reflect your deepest truth. Jung spoke of enantiodromia, the principle by which any extreme position eventually gives way to its opposite. You who have perhaps lived so passionately, so fully engaged with the world's offerings, now find yourself in the opposite territory, a place of profound disengagement that feels almost otherworldly. This is not punishment or pathology. It is the psyche's natural rhythm, the tide that must recede before it can return with greater force and clarity. In the mythology of transformation, this is the moment when the hero must cross the threshold into the underworld, leaving behind the familiar landscape of ordinary consciousness. Persephone's descent into Hades was not a kidnapping but an initiation, a necessary journey into the realm of shadows where the seeds of new life gestate in darkness. Your current grayness is your Hades, your underworld, where the old self must die before the new self can be born. The silence between heartbeats, do you feel it? That pause where everything stops, where the world holds its breath before the next pulse of life begins. This is where you dwell now, in that eternal moment between one rhythm and the next, between one way of being and another that has not yet announced itself. It is a liminal space, a threshold realm where the ordinary rules of engagement no longer apply. You may find that solitude no longer feels empty but strangely full, as if the absence of external stimulation has created space for something more subtle to emerge. The quiet that once felt like death now pulses with its own kind of aliveness, not the loud, demanding aliveness of passion and pursuit, but the deep, underground aliveness of roots extending into fertile darkness, of seeds dreaming their way toward light. This is the wisdom of the hermit archetype, not the bitter withdrawal of misanthropy, but the conscious retreat of one who knows that certain revelations can only come in solitude, that certain conversations can only be heard when the external world falls silent. Your soul has begun to tune into frequencies that are drowned out by the noise of ordinary engagement, frequencies that carry messages about your deeper purpose, your authentic path, your true calling. The gray filter through which you now perceive the world is not a diminishment of reality, but a different kind of sight, one that sees through the colorful distractions to the essential structures beneath. Like an X-ray that reveals the bones hidden by flesh, this strange new vision shows you the skeleton of your life, the fundamental framework upon which everything else has been built. Some of that framework, you now realize, was constructed from materials that cannot support the weight of who you are becoming. In the silence between heartbeats, you may begin to hear other sounds, the whisper of your own deepest knowing, the rustle of possibilities not yet born, the ancient song that your soul has been humming since before you learned the words that would later become your identity. These sounds are always present, but they can only be heard when the louder music of ego and ambition and social performance finally grows quiet. This is the gift hidden within this gray season, not the absence of meaning, but the presence of meaning so profound that it cannot be grasped by the ordinary mind, cannot be pursued through ordinary channels, cannot be satisfied by ordinary achievements. Your withdrawal from external stimulation is actually an approach toward internal revelation, a turning inward that will eventually yield treasures no external pursuit could ever provide. The passion that seems to have abandoned you has not died. It has gone underground, like sap retreating into the roots of a tree during winter, gathering itself for a spring that will be unlike any you have known before. This is not the passion of youth, with its bright hungers and urgent needs, but the passion of depth, the slow-burning fire that illuminates rather than consumes, that transforms rather than merely excites. In this place of profound quiet, you are being prepared for something your conscious mind cannot yet imagine. The old fires had to die so that new ones could be kindled, fires that burn not with the fuel of external validation or achievement or even love as you have known it, but with the eternal flame of your own deepest nature, your own essential being, your own irreplaceable piece of the cosmic mystery. Trust this gray season, this winter of the soul, this silence between heartbeats. It is not emptiness, but fullness, the fullness of infinite possibility, of dreams not yet dreamed, of songs not yet sung, of a life not yet lived. In the hermit's cave of your current withdrawal, something is stirring that will eventually emerge as your most authentic self, your truest gift, your deepest contribution to the great conversation of existence. The silence is speaking, and you are finally learning how to listen. There is a peculiar form of exhaustion that settles into the bones, not from what we have done, but from what we have carried. Invisible weights that accumulate over years, decades, sometimes entire lifetimes, until we find ourselves bent beneath burdens we never consciously chose to bear. These are the chains that cannot be seen by the naked eye, forged not from iron and steel, but from the expectations, projections, and unlived dreams of others. They wrap themselves around our spirit with such subtlety that we often mistake their weight for our own natural substance, believing that this heaviness is simply who we are rather than what we have agreed to carry. Jung understood this phenomenon with profound clarity when he spoke of the collective unconscious and the way ancestral patterns move through generations like underground rivers, surfacing in the most unexpected places. You may find yourself living out the frustrated ambitions of a grandmother you never met, carrying forward the unspoken shame of a father who could never express his true feelings, or shouldering the weight of cultural expectations that were outdated before you were even born. These invisible chains bind us to destinies that were never truly our own, yet we drag them forward with the devotion of a prisoner who has forgotten that freedom is possible. Consider the image of Atlas, condemned by the gods to hold up the heavens for eternity. But what if Atlas had simply forgotten that he could let go? What if the punishment had ended long ago, but the habit of carrying had become so ingrained that he could no longer imagine existence without the weight upon his shoulders? This is precisely the predicament in which many of us find ourselves, bearing worlds that we never built, supporting structures that we never designed, maintaining systems that serve purposes we do not even understand. The weight begins to accumulate in childhood, when we first learn that love and acceptance come with conditions. Be a good boy. Make us proud. Don't disappoint the family. These seemingly innocent phrases carry within them the seeds of a lifetime's burden, for they teach us that our worth is contingent upon meeting the needs and expectations of others. We learn to scan the environment constantly for signs of approval or disapproval, becoming exquisitely sensitive to the unspoken demands that surround us like an invisible web. As we grow older, these patterns become increasingly sophisticated and difficult to detect. We choose careers that will impress our parents rather than fulfill our souls. We pursue relationships that look good on paper rather than nourish our hearts. We live in neighborhoods that enhance our status rather than support our well-being. Layer by layer, choice by unconscious choice, we construct lives that serve the collective expectations of our culture, our family, our social sphere, until we find ourselves trapped within a beautiful prison of our own making. The exhaustion that results from this process is unlike any other form of fatigue. It is the weariness of carrying water in a bucket with no bottom, of climbing a mountain that grows taller with each step, of running a race where the finish line moves further away the faster we run. No amount of achievement can satisfy expectations that are not truly our own. No level of success can fill a hunger that belongs to someone else's unlived life. Jung spoke often of the concept of projection, the unconscious tendency to see in others what we cannot or will not acknowledge in ourselves. But projection works both ways. Just as we project our own unlived potential onto others, so too do others project their unfulfilled dreams and desires onto us. Parents project their abandoned ambitions onto their children. Cultures project their collective shadow onto the individual. Social groups project their need for belonging onto those who dare to stand apart. These projections become like invisible tentacles reaching across generations and cultural boundaries to wrap themselves around our spirit. We find ourselves living not one life, but many, our own authentic existence buried beneath layers of borrowed identity, inherited trauma, and collective expectation. The weight of these invisible chains grows heavier with each passing year until even the simplest acts of self-expression feel like acts of rebellion against an entire universe of demand. The tragedy is not that we carry these burdens. In many ways, this is an inevitable part of the human condition, but that we carry them unconsciously, believing them to be our own authentic desires rather than inherited obligations. We mistake the voice of the collective for the voice of our own soul. We confuse the path carved out by others with our own unique journey. We become so accustomed to the weight of these invisible chains that we cannot imagine what it might feel like to move through the world unburdened. This is what Jung meant when he spoke of the necessity of differentiating between the ego and the self. The ego is largely constructed from these inherited patterns, these collective expectations, these unconscious projections. It is the part of us that tries to be what others need us to be, that seeks to fulfill the dreams that others could not realize, that carries forward the unfinished business of previous generations. The self, on the other hand, is our authentic essence, the unique expression of life force that belongs to us and us alone. The process of individuation requires us to gradually become conscious of these invisible chains, to recognize which burdens truly belong to us and which we have unconsciously inherited from others. This is delicate work, for it requires us to disappoint people we love, to challenge systems that have given our lives structure and meaning, to risk the loss of approval and belonging that comes with choosing authenticity over compliance. Yet there is no other path to genuine freedom. As long as we remain unconscious of the weight we carry, we will continue to experience the peculiar exhaustion of living someone else's life while believing it to be our own. We will keep running toward finish lines that bring no satisfaction, climbing mountains that offer no view, carrying water that never quenches our deepest thirst. The invitation is not to reject all expectations or to live in complete isolation from the needs and desires of others. Rather, it is to develop the capacity to choose consciously which burdens we take on and which we set down. It is to learn the difference between healthy responsibility and unconscious bondage. It is to discover what remains when we stop carrying what was never truly ours to bear. This process requires tremendous courage, for it means facing the possibility that much of what we have called our identity is actually a collection of borrowed parts. It means risking the disapproval of those who benefit from our unconscious compliance. It means stepping into the unknown territory of authentic selfhood, where there are no guaranteed outcomes and no predetermined paths. But in this risk lies the possibility of a different kind of existence, one where our energy serves our own deepest purpose rather than the unlived dreams of others, one where the weight we carry is chosen rather than inherited, one where our chains, if we choose to wear them at all, are made of gold rather than lead. There is a monastery within every soul, a sacred space where silence dwells like incense in stone chambers, where the deepest truths are whispered in languages older than words. But when spiritual fatigue reaches its fifth threshold, this holy sanctuary becomes invaded by merchants of the mind, voices that hawk their wares of worry, criticism, and fear with the relentless energy of a marketplace at dawn. The contemplative space where wisdom once breathed freely becomes a cacophony of internal noise, each voice demanding attention, drowning out the gentle whisper of your authentic self beneath the clamor. You sit in what should be stillness, yet your inner world erupts with the voices of 1,000 internalized others. The critical parent speaks first, as it always does, with the authority of years and the sharp edge of disappointment. You should be further along by now. You should have it figured out. You should be better, stronger, more accomplished. Its words echo off the walls of your consciousness like stones thrown into a well, each impact sending ripples through the waters of your peace. Behind it comes the voice of societal expectation, dressed in the uniform of productivity and success. Time is money. Rest is laziness. If you're not moving forward, you're falling behind. The world doesn't wait for your spiritual journey. It demands results, achievements, proof of your worth, measured in metrics that matter to markets and shareholders. This voice carries the weight of collective anxiety, the fever dream of a civilization that has forgotten how to breathe. Then the shadows begin to speak, all the disowned parts of yourself that have been banished to the outer darkness of consciousness. They whisper of inadequacy and failure, of dreams abandoned and potentials left to wither. They speak in the language of what if and if only, painting pictures of alternate realities where you made different choices, where you were braver, wiser, more authentic from the beginning. Their voices carry the particular exhaustion of regret, heavy as wet wool against the skin of awareness. The fearful self adds its trembling commentary. What if you're wrong? What if this journey leads nowhere? What if peace is just another illusion, another way of avoiding the harsh realities of existence? What if stillness is just another form of hiding? Fear speaks in questions that have no answers, creating mental mazes where the soul wanders, lost and growing more weary with each turn. Like a monk whose monastery has been invaded by merchants, you find yourself unable to access the contemplative space where true wisdom dwells. The sacred silence that once offered refuge from the world's chaos has been colonized by the very forces you sought to escape. The inner sanctuary, which should be your refuge, becomes another battlefield where thoughts wage war against each other with the viciousness of ancient enemies. You try to meditate, but the mind rebels like a child, forced to sit still in church. Instead of peace, you find only the echo chamber of internal commentary, each thought bouncing off the walls of awareness, amplifying and distorting as it ricochets through the corridors of consciousness. The silence you seek recedes like a mirage, always visible on the horizon, but impossible to reach through the desert of mental noise. This is not the productive thinking that solves problems or creates beauty. This is the desperate mental thrashing of a drowning mind, grabbing at thoughts like pieces of debris in a flood. The exhaustion comes not from the effort of concentration, but from the relentless attempt to think your way to peace, to analyze your way to stillness, to understand your way to a place that can only be reached through surrender. The voices multiply like cells dividing, each spawning new variations of the same old themes. The inner critic splits into a committee of judges, each with their own specialty of disapproval. The anxious self branches into a network of worriers, each focused on a different potential catastrophe. The regretful self becomes a chorus of mourners, lamenting every path not taken. The chamber of your consciousness fills with noise until there is no space left for anything resembling peace. You begin to mistake this cacophony for consciousness itself, believing that the marketplace of internal voices is simply how minds work, how awareness functions. The exhaustion deepens as you expend enormous energy trying to organize this chaos, to moderate between competing voices, to find some thread of coherent narrative. In the tangle of conflicting commentary, you become not the inhabitant of your own mind, but its overwhelmed administrator, frantically trying to manage a system that has grown beyond all reasonable governance. The sacred silence retreats deeper and deeper into the recesses of being, like a shy animal hiding from the noise of human activity. It still exists. It must exist, for it is the ground from which all consciousness springs, but it becomes increasingly difficult to access beneath the layers of accumulated mental sediment. The exhaustion you feel is the fatigue of a pilgrim who has lost the path to the shrine, wandering in circles through territories that grow more familiar and more hopeless with each repetition. Yet in the very recognition of this noise, something begins to shift. The awareness that can observe the cacophony is itself not part of the chaos. Like a still point in a turning world, there remains within you a quality of consciousness that can witness the marketplace without being caught up in its transactions. This witnessing awareness, what Jung might have called the transcendent function, offers the first glimpse of hope. In the midst of internal bedlam, the exhaustion itself becomes a teacher, showing you the futility of trying to achieve peace through mental effort alone. Each failed attempt to think your way to stillness reveals another layer of attachment to the very noise you're trying to escape. The voices persist precisely because you continue to engage with them, to argue with them, to try to reason them into silence. They feed on attention like fires feed on oxygen, growing stronger with each attempt to extinguish them through direct confrontation. Slowly, you begin to understand that the monastery of inner silence was never destroyed. It was simply obscured by the temporary structures that anxiety and conditioning have built in its courtyard. The sacred space remains intact beneath the noise, patient as stone, waiting for the merchants to exhaust themselves and the marketplace to empty as all markets eventually do when the day's trading is done. The exhaustion you feel is not just personal. It is the accumulated fatigue of a culture that has forgotten how to be still, that mistakes activity for progress, that confuses the volume of internal noise with the depth of internal life. You carry within yourself the collective weariness of a species that has lost touch with the healing power of silence, that has forgotten how to rest in being rather than always reaching toward becoming. But exhaustion, when fully felt and honored, becomes the doorway back to simplicity. When the effort to control the inner noise finally collapses under its own weight, when the attempt to manage the marketplace of mind finally fails completely, there emerges a different quality of awareness, one that can observe without engaging, witness without participating, remain still while the voices continue their dance of distraction. In this stillness that is not the absence of noise, but the presence of something deeper than noise, you begin to remember the monastery that was never truly abandoned. The sacred silence reveals itself not as something you must achieve, but as something you must remember how to receive. It was always there, waiting beneath the cacophony like bedrock beneath topsoil, solid and enduring and completely indifferent to the temporary storms that rage across the surface of consciousness. The echo chamber begins to lose its power when you stop trying to silence it and simply let it echo in the vastness of your deeper awareness. The voices continue their chatter, but they no longer fill the entire space of being. Room opens around them, space for something quieter, something truer, something that speaks not in words but in the quality of presence itself. The exhaustion transforms from a burden to carry into a doorway to walk through, leading back to the monastery of your own essential nature, where silence lives eternal and peace requires no effort to maintain. In the landscape of the transforming soul, there comes a season unlike any other, a season when the Very waters of feeling cease their flow and become still as ancient ice. This is the sixth manifestation of our spiritual metamorphosis, arriving not with the drama of storm or earthquake, but with the profound silence of a world suddenly muffled by snow. We discover ourselves standing at the edge of what was once a rushing river of emotion, now frozen solid beneath layers of protective numbness. Listen to the quality of this silence. It is not the peaceful quiet of meditation or the restful pause between thoughts. This is the silence of suspension, of life held in abeyance, as if our emotional landscape has been placed under a spell that promises safety but delivers only a strange kind of living death. We have become observers of our own existence, watching our lives unfold from behind a wall of invisible glass, present but not participating, seeing but not truly experiencing the full spectrum of what it means to be human. The river that once carried the waters of our joy, our sorrow, our anger, and our love has grown still, not by choice, but by necessity. The psyche, in its ancient wisdom, has recognized that we have been overwhelmed by the intensity of feeling, by the constant demands placed upon our emotional resources. Like a circuit breaker that trips to prevent a fire, our capacity for feeling has shut down to protect us from complete overwhelm. Yet in this protection, we find ourselves trapped in a twilight realm, where nothing quite reaches us, where even the most significant events in our lives feel strangely distant and unreal. Jung understood this frozen state as one of the necessary passages in the soul's journey toward wholeness. He knew that sometimes the unconscious must withdraw its energy from feeling in order to preserve the essential core of our being. But understanding this intellectually does nothing to diminish the profound disorientation of living in this emotional winter. We find ourselves asking, is this still me? Am I still alive in any meaningful sense? The person who once wept at movies, who felt the stirring of spring in their bones, who could be moved to laughter or tears by a piece of music, where have they gone? The terrifying aspect of this numbness is not simply the absence of feeling, but the way it makes us question our very humanity. We watch ourselves go through the motions of caring, of loving, of being moved by beauty or tragedy, but it is as if we are actors who have forgotten not just our lines, but the language itself. We know intellectually that we should feel something about the sunset, about the embrace of a loved one, about news of loss or celebration, but the knowing and the feeling exist in separate worlds that no longer touch. This is the paradox of the frozen river. We are simultaneously protected and imprisoned by our own numbness. The ice that shields us from being overwhelmed also cuts us off from the very experiences that make life worth living. We find ourselves longing desperately for authentic emotion while being utterly unable to access it. It is like being hungry but having lost the ability to taste, or being thirsty while standing next to water we cannot drink. In this strange season of the soul, we become intimately acquainted with a particular kind of spiritual exhaustion, the exhaustion of being too tired to feel. This is not the tiredness that comes from feeling too much, but rather the profound depletion that results from the constant effort of trying to break through to our own emotions. We push against the ice, we search for cracks, we wait for signs of thaw, but the frozen river remains stubbornly solid beneath our feet. Yet like seeds buried too deep in winter soil, our feelings have not disappeared. They have gone underground, waiting in the darkness for conditions that will allow them to emerge once again. The unconscious holds them in trust, protecting them from the harsh conditions above ground, nurturing them in the secret chambers of the psyche until the time is right for their return. This is the promise hidden within the curse of numbness, that what has been frozen can thaw, that what has been buried can grow, that what has been silenced can speak again. The ghost-like quality of this existence haunts us in unexpected moments. We catch ourselves in mirrors and wonder who is looking back. We hear our own voice speaking words of comfort or concern and marvel at how distant it sounds, as if it belongs to someone else entirely. Relationships become strange theatrical performances where we know our role but cannot feel our way into the part. We love, but the love feels theoretical. We grieve, but the grief feels borrowed from someone else's experience. This emotional winter teaches us something crucial about the nature of feeling itself, that it is not merely a luxury or an indulgence, but the very medium through which we experience meaning and connection. Without it, we are like radios that can receive the signal but cannot convert it into sound. The information reaches us, but it remains trapped in a form we cannot use, cannot integrate into the living tissue of our experience. The people around us often cannot understand this frozen state, because from the outside, we may appear to be functioning normally. We go to work, we have conversations, we fulfill our obligations, but inside, we are wandering through an emotional tundra where every landmark has been covered by snow, where the familiar pathways of feeling have become unrecognizable. We are explorers lost in our own inner landscape, carrying maps that no longer correspond to the territory we find ourselves in. The hunger for authentic emotion becomes almost physical in its intensity. We find ourselves drawn to experiences that might break through the ice. Intense films, challenging conversations, even difficult situations that once would have been overwhelming. We are like people pressing their faces to windows, hoping to feel the warmth of the fire on the other side of the glass. But the numbness holds us in its grip, allowing us to understand intellectually what we are missing while keeping us unable to access it directly. In the depths of this frozen season, we begin to understand that this too is part of the great transformation. The river has not frozen permanently. It has entered a necessary phase of stillness, a time when the waters that once ran wild and uncontrolled are being gathered and preserved for future flowing. The ice is not our enemy, but our temporary protector, holding space for the eventual thaw that will come when our system has recovered its capacity to feel without being destroyed by feeling. As we learn to inhabit this strange landscape, with patience rather than panic, we discover that even numbness has its gifts. In the absence of overwhelming emotion, we can sometimes see more clearly, think more calmly, observe the patterns of our life with a detachment that might not have been possible when we were caught in the current of intense feeling. The frozen river offers us a different kind of wisdom, the wisdom of stillness, of waiting, of trusting in the cyclical nature of the soul's seasons. The thaw will come. It always does. But for now, we walk carefully across the ice, learning to trust that beneath the frozen surface, life continues its secret work of renewal and preparation, gathering strength for the day when feeling will flow freely once again through the channels of our awakening heart. There comes a moment in the soul's evolution when the compass that has guided your steps for so long begins to spin wildly, its needle swinging in frantic circles, no longer able to find its magnetic north. You stand at the crossroads of your own making, holding this broken instrument of direction, watching as everything you once believed would lead you home dissolves into arbitrary waypoints on a map that suddenly makes no sense. This is the seventh manifestation of the soul's rebellion, perhaps the most disorienting of all. For here, in this landscape of collapsed certainty, you discover that the goals that once pulled you forward with such magnetic force now seem as hollow as lighthouses built on shifting sand. The career ladder you've been climbing leads to a platform you no longer wish to reach. The dreams you've been pursuing feel like someone else's dreams, inherited rather than chosen, worn like ill-fitting clothes you never remember putting on. This is not a crisis of achievement, but something far more fundamental, a crisis of meaning itself. Your soul, in its relentless journey toward authenticity, has begun to recognize that you have been traveling roads that lead nowhere you actually want to go. The exhaustion you feel is not the tiredness of effort, but the profound fatigue of a pilgrim who suddenly realizes they have been walking in circles while believing they were progressing toward a sacred destination. Jung understood this territory of shattered purpose, this place where the ego's carefully constructed goals collapse under the weight of the self's deeper knowing. He called it the encounter with meaninglessness, not as pathology, but as a necessary phase in the individuation process, a dark night of the soul where old orientations must die before new ones can be born. Your broken compass is not a sign of failure. It is a sign that you have outgrown the magnetic fields that once guided you. Listen to the profound silence that follows the shattering of certainty. In this quietude, stripped of the familiar urgency of goal pursuit, you may hear for the first time the deeper currents of your own being, currents that have been flowing beneath the surface of your conscious intentions all along, waiting for the noise of false purpose to subside before they could make themselves known. The lighthouses you once trusted, success, recognition, security, even love as you have defined it, now stand revealed as constructions built on foundations that shift with every tide. What seemed so solid, so permanently positioned to guide your navigation, now appears as temporary as sandcastles, beautiful perhaps, but never meant to be the permanent markers by which you orient your entire existence. In this place of dissolved direction, you may find yourself asking questions that have no ready answers. Who am I when I am not striving toward anything? What remains when all the goals fall away? What is the purpose of purpose itself? These are not questions the mind can answer with its usual strategies of analysis and planning. They are questions that must be lived into, breathed through, allowed to transform you from the inside out. The disorientation you feel is actually reorientation beginning, a turning away from magnetic north as defined by others toward a true north that can only be found within the depths of your own authentic nature. Your soul is no longer willing to be directed by external compasses, no longer content to follow maps drawn by previous generations, no longer satisfied with destinations that looked appealing from a distance, but offer no nourishment for your deeper hunger. This is the territory of existential fatigue, where even the act of wanting becomes exhausting because you can no longer trust your wants, can no longer be certain that what you think you desire is actually your desire at all. How much of what you've been pursuing belongs to you, and how much was inherited from family expectations, social conditioning, the collective dreams of your time and place. In this gray landscape of collapsed purpose, such questions become unavoidable. Yet within this apparent emptiness, something profound is stirring. The shattering of your old compass is making space for a new kind of navigation, one that relies not on external markers but on internal knowing, not on predetermined destinations but on moment-by-moment attunement to the deeper rhythms of your own becoming. This is the difference between following a map and learning to read the territory itself. The ancient myths speak of heroes who must lose their way completely before they can find their true path. Theseus in the labyrinth, wandering in darkness until he learns to trust the thread that connects him to his deepest source. Dante in the dark wood, having lost the straight path, discovering that the journey through hell and purgatory is the only way to paradise. Your shattered compass marks the beginning of such a journey, not toward a destination you can name, but toward a way of being you cannot yet imagine. In this place of broken navigation, you may discover that purpose itself has been redefined. No longer the external achievement of goals, but the internal alignment with your deepest truth. No longer the reaching toward future fulfillment, but the embodiment of meaning in each present moment. No longer the pursuit of what should be, but the recognition and honoring of what is, including this very disorientation, this very lostness, this very collapse of the structures that once seemed so essential. The compass needle that spins wildly is actually searching for a new magnetic field, one generated not by external forces but by the gravitational pull of your own authentic center. This center cannot be found through effort or strategy, or even through seeking. It can only be discovered through surrender, through the willingness to be lost until a new kind of finding becomes possible. Your soul knows what your mind has forgotten, that true purpose cannot be pursued but only embodied, cannot be achieved but only expressed, cannot be reached but only lived. The goals that once seemed so important were perhaps just training wheels, necessary for a time, but eventually obstacles to the deeper riding that wants to happen through you. In the silence left by shattered purpose, listen for the whisper of authentic calling, not the loud demands of ambition or the urgent pressures of survival, but the quiet invitation of your deepest nature to express itself through the unique constellation of gifts, wounds, and mysteries that you are. This calling cannot be manufactured or marketed or even fully understood. It can only be followed one uncertain step at a time, with a compass that points not toward external north, but toward the magnetic field of your own becoming. The lighthouses may have crumbled, but new stars are appearing in the darkness, not the fixed stars of predetermined destiny, but the moving stars of living purpose, purpose that shifts and evolves as you shift and evolve, purpose that is less about arriving somewhere and more about honoring the journey itself as sacred, meaningful, worthy of your deepest devotion. Trust this shattering, trust this lostness, trust the spinning needle that refuses to point toward false norths. In the apparent chaos of directionless wandering, a new kind of order is being born, not the order of maps and plans and goals, but the deeper order of authentic being, where every step, however uncertain, is guided by the invisible compass of your own deepest knowing. In the ancient traditions, the body was revered as the sacred temple of the soul, a living, breathing sanctuary where spirit and matter converged in perfect harmony. The priests of old understood that to neglect the temple was to invite the departure of the divine presence, that the physical vessel required constant attention and reverence to maintain its capacity to house the ineffable. Yet somewhere in our journey toward modernity, we have forgotten this fundamental truth, treating our bodies as mere machines to be driven ever harder, ignoring their whispered warnings until they begin to scream in languages we can no longer pretend not to understand. The rebellion begins quietly, as all authentic revolutions do, a persistent ache in the lower back that no amount of stretching seems to relieve, a fatigue that settles into your bones despite adequate sleep, headaches that appear with clockwork regularity, as if your skull were too small to contain the thoughts you carry, digestive issues that seem to have no correlation with what you eat. These symptoms emerge like scouts before an army, testing the boundaries of your awareness, seeking to determine whether you will listen to their message or continue to dismiss them as inconvenient interruptions to your carefully scheduled life. Jung recognized that the psyche and soma are not separate entities, but different aspects of the same unified whole. What affects one inevitably impacts the other, creating a continuous dialogue between consciousness and flesh that most of us have learned to ignore or override. When we live in persistent conflict with our authentic nature, when we force ourselves into patterns and relationships that violate our deepest truth, The body becomes the keeper of this discord, the faithful recorder of every betrayal we commit against ourselves. Consider the image of a temple whose priests have gradually abandoned their posts, one by one, until only the structure remains, beautiful from the outside, hollow within. The rituals that once connected earth to heaven have been forgotten. The sacred fires have grown cold. The offerings have ceased to flow. This is what happens when we neglect the essential relationship between our spiritual truth and our physical expression. The body, like the abandoned temple, begins to deteriorate not from any external attack, but from the absence of the care and attention it requires to maintain its sacred function. The symptoms that emerge during this rebellion are not random or meaningless. They are the body's attempt to communicate in the only language it knows, the language of sensation, of discomfort, of physical manifestation. A tight throat when we swallow words we need to speak. Tension in the shoulders when we carry burdens that are not ours to bear. Digestive problems when we cannot stomach the life we are living. Lower back pain when we feel unsupported in our deepest endeavors. These are not mere coincidences, but the body's wisdom expressing itself through the poetry of symptom and sensation. Western medicine, for all its remarkable achievements, has trained us to view the body as a collection of separate systems that can be analyzed and treated in isolation. But the ancient healers understood something that we have largely forgotten, that every physical symptom carries within it a message from the soul, a communication about the state of our inner alignment or the depth of our spiritual discord. When we treat symptoms without addressing their deeper meaning, we silence the messenger while ignoring the message, often driving the body to escalate its communications in increasingly dramatic ways. This is not to suggest that all physical ailments are psychosomatic in origin, or that serious medical conditions should be dismissed as mere spiritual metaphors. Rather, it is to recognize that even when there are clear physiological causes for our symptoms, there may also be deeper layers of meaning that invite our attention. The body exists at the intersection of matter and spirit, serving as a bridge between the visible and invisible worlds, and its communications often carry information that transcends the purely physical realm. The rebellion of the body temple becomes particularly pronounced when we are living lives that fundamentally contradict our essential nature. If you are naturally contemplative but force yourself into a high-pressure, constantly stimulating environment, your nervous system will eventually rebel. If you are inherently creative but spend your days in mechanical, repetitive tasks, your life force will begin to stagnate, manifesting in symptoms of depression, fatigue, or chronic illness. If you are deeply sensitive but surround yourself with harsh, aggressive people, your immune system may begin to falter, unable to maintain its defenses in an environment that feels constantly threatening. Jung wrote extensively about the phenomenon of enantiodromia, the tendency of psychological and physical systems to swing toward their opposite when pushed too far in one direction. The body's rebellion can be understood as a form of enantiodromia, a natural corrective response to the extremes we have imposed upon ourselves. When we push too hard for too long, the body pushes back with equal force, demanding the rest, care, and attention we have denied it. The wisdom traditions teach us that healing begins with listening, truly listening to what our bodies are trying to tell us. This requires a fundamental shift in consciousness, from viewing symptoms as enemies to be defeated, to recognizing them as messengers carrying vital information about the state of our inner world. It means learning to dialogue with our physical experience rather than simply trying to silence it with medication or ignore it through sheer force of will. The process of re-establishing a sacred relationship with the body requires patience, humility, and a willingness to make difficult changes in how we live. It may mean slowing down when every fiber of our conditioning tells us to speed up. It may mean saying no to opportunities that look good on paper but feel wrong in our bones. It may mean creating space for rest, for contemplation, for the simple pleasure of existing without purpose or agenda. This rebellion is not a punishment, but an invitation to return to the ancient covenant between spirit and flesh, to remember that we are not minds trapped in physical prisons, but integrated beings whose deepest wisdom emerges from the marriage of consciousness and embodiment. The body's rebellion is ultimately an act of love, a fierce compassion that refuses to allow us to continue betraying ourselves without consequence. When we begin to listen deeply to our physical experience, when we honor the body's wisdom rather than overriding it, something miraculous begins to happen. The temple starts to come alive again. The sacred fires rekindle. The dialogue between heaven and earth resumes. We discover that our bodies are not obstacles to our spiritual development, but essential partners in the journey toward wholeness. The rebellion of the body temple is calling you home, home to yourself, to your truth, to the sacred integration of all that you are. The question is not whether you will listen, but how long you will wait before you begin to hear. There comes a season in the soul's journey when the wells that once overflowed with sacred water become nothing more than circles of cracked earth, their bottoms visible for the first time in memory. The drought of inspiration descends like a slow curse, transforming landscapes that once bloomed with wonder into territories of dust and silence. You stand before the altars of practices that once lifted you beyond yourself, but now they feel as empty as abandoned temples, their gods departed for regions unknown. This is the 9th sign of spiritual exhaustion, not the absence of effort, but the presence of effort without grace. You perform the familiar gestures of your spiritual practice like an actor who has forgotten why the play was written. The words of prayer move through your mouth without touching your heart. The postures of meditation hold your body but cannot reach your soul. The rituals that once connected you to something larger than yourself now feel like archaeological exercises, hollow reenactments of a faith that has somehow slipped through your fingers like sand. The books that once sparked recognition now read like instructions written in a foreign language. The teachers who once seemed to speak directly to your condition now sound like voices echoing from across an unbridgeable chasm. The music that once transported you to realms beyond the ordinary now plays as mere sound, pleasant perhaps, but no longer capable of opening doors in consciousness that you cannot remember how to find. You have become a tourist in your own spiritual landscape, observing from the outside practices that once engaged the very core of your being. Like a priestess whose oracle has gone silent, you find yourself stripped of the inner knowing that once guided your steps through uncertainty. The voice that whispered direction in moments of confusion has withdrawn into a silence so complete it makes you question whether it ever spoke at all. Where once intuition flowed like a river feeding all the gardens of decision, now there is only the harsh logic of survival, the mechanical calculation of cost and benefit in a world that has lost its capacity to surprise you with meaning. This drought touches everything. Creativity becomes effort without joy, words strung together by will rather than inspiration. The canvas remains blank, not from lack of ideas, but from the terrible knowledge that ideas alone cannot breathe life into dead matter. The pen moves across paper, but the words feel like stones rather than seeds, incapable of growing into anything that might nourish another soul. Art becomes exercise, creation becomes labor, and beauty becomes a concept rather than a lived experience. You begin to suspect that the sacred has withdrawn from the world entirely, or perhaps that you have somehow forfeited your membership in the community of those who can still perceive its presence. The numinous, that quality of experience that once made ordinary moments pulse with extraordinary significance, seems to have migrated to other souls, other lives, other times. You walk through sunsets that should stir wonder and feel only the mechanics of light, refracting through atmospheric particles. You witness births and deaths, the supposed pinnacles of meaning, and register only biological processes proceeding according to natural law. The dark night of the soul that Jung spoke of settles over consciousness like a landscape without stars. Even the darkness lacks the pregnant mystery it once held. It is simply darkness, absence rather than presence, void rather than potential. The dreams that once brought messages from the unconscious now seem like random neural firings. The synchronicities that once whispered of deeper patterns now appear as mere coincidence in a universe governed by probability rather than purpose. Yet perhaps most terrifying is the growing suspicion that this drought is not temporary, that inspiration may not return, that the sacred may have been nothing more than a beautiful delusion, an evolutionary trick to make meaning-seeking creatures more capable of survival. The practices continue not from faith but from habit, not from hope but from the terrible fear that stopping them might confirm what you most dread, that the well was always empty, that you were drinking mirages, that the whole spiritual journey was an elaborate self-deception. In this wasteland of meaning, reason becomes both lifeline and prison. Logic offers the comfort of predictability, the safety of cause and effect, the reassurance that some things can still be understood, even if they can no longer be felt. But reason alone feels like trying to nourish yourself on stones, technically possible to survive on, but lacking all the vitamins that make life worth living. You navigate by mental maps rather than inner compass, making decisions based on analysis rather than instinct, moving through a world that has become a problem to be solved rather than a mystery to be lived. The exhaustion that accompanies this drought is unlike any other. It is the fatigue of a soul trying to run on empty, attempting to generate meaning through effort alone when meaning has always been a gift rather than an achievement. You push forward through spiritual practices like a farmer working fields during famine, going through all the motions of cultivation while knowing the rains may never come. The discipline itself becomes a kind of prayer, not because you feel called to it, but because it is the only thread connecting you to who you used to be when the world still spoke. But drought, when fully experienced, carries its own teachings. In the absolute absence of inspiration, you begin to discover which aspects of your spiritual life were authentic and which were merely the beautiful decorations of a faith that had not yet been tested. The practices that survive the drought are those rooted not in feeling but in commitment, not in reward but in faithfulness to something larger than the immediate experience of meaning or its absence. The cracked earth of consciousness begins to reveal the bedrock beneath, not the exciting discoveries of spiritual seeking, but the simple fact of awareness itself, which continues regardless of whether it finds anything meaningful to be aware of. In this recognition, the first drops of a different kind of nourishment begin to fall, not the intoxicating wine of inspiration, but the clear water of simple being, which asks nothing of you except that you continue to exist, to breathe, to witness whatever arises in the field of consciousness. The drought teaches what the flood never could, that the sacred was never dependent on your ability to feel it, that inspiration was never the source of meaning but merely one of its expressions, that the oracle's silence may itself be a form of communication from depths too profound for words. In learning to live without the consolations of meaning, you discover the deeper consolation of being itself, which requires no justification, no purpose, no inspiration to validate its absolute worth. The wells may remain empty, but something deeper than wells continues to sustain the soul through seasons of plenty and seasons of want. The priestess learns to serve not the oracle's voice, but the silence from which all voices emerge and to which they eventually return. In the deepest chambers of the transforming soul, where even the bravest explorers hesitate to venture, we encounter the 10th and most profound manifestation of our spiritual awakening. Here, in this sacred wound that never quite heals, we meet the phantom pain of our unlived life, that exquisite ache for all the possibilities that remain trapped within us, like butterflies pressed between the pages of a book we were too afraid to open. This is not the simple regret of missed opportunities or wrong turns taken. This is something far more elemental, more devastating in its implications. It is the soul's recognition of its own vastness, pressed against the narrow confines of the life we have actually chosen to live. Like a ghost limb that continues to reach for objects that will never be grasped, we feel the persistent ache of talents never developed, passions never pursued, authentic expressions of self that were buried alive beneath the weight of practical considerations and social expectations. Listen to the quality of this exhaustion. It carries within it the accumulated weight of every moment we said no to our deepest impulses, every time we chose safety over authenticity, every instance when we allowed fear to edit the natural expression of our being. This is not the tiredness that comes from action, but the bone-deep fatigue that results from a lifetime of holding back, of containing the wild rivers of possibility that flow through our veins. The phantom pain manifests in strange and unexpected ways. We find ourselves inexplicably moved by stories of people who had the courage to follow their unconventional paths. We feel a mysterious grief when we encounter art, music, or writing that seems to come from the same source of inspiration we have kept locked away within ourselves. There is a recognition there, a painful acknowledgement of kinship, with expressions of creativity and authenticity that we have never allowed ourselves to explore. Jung understood this phenomenon as the shadow side of civilization itself, the price we pay for belonging to a world that rewards conformity and punishes deviation from established patterns. But he also knew that this phantom pain serves as a compass, pointing always toward the unlived aspects of ourselves that hunger for expression. The very intensity of our longing becomes a map, showing us where our authentic power lies buried. In the middle of ordinary days, we are sometimes ambushed by visions of the life we might have lived. They come to us in dreams, in moments of unexpected stillness, in the spaces between thoughts where our carefully constructed defenses drop away. We see ourselves as the artist we never became, the adventurer who never left home, the lover who never learned to be vulnerable, the teacher who never trusted their own wisdom. These visions are not fantasies but memories, memories of potential that remains as real and present as our actual history. The cruelest aspect of this phantom pain is how it makes us complicit in our own diminishment. We realize with startling clarity that the cage we inhabit was not built by others but by our own hands, bar by bar, choice by cautious choice. Each decision to play it safe, to fit in, to be reasonable rather than authentic, has contributed to the construction of a life that feels too small to contain the magnitude of what we might have been. This recognition brings with it a particular kind of spiritual fatigue, the exhaustion of fighting against our own nature. For years, perhaps decades, we have been like salmon swimming downstream, expending enormous energy to move against the current of our own authentic desires. We have become experts at talking ourselves out of our own impulses, at finding rational reasons why our deepest longings are impractical, unrealistic, selfish. The phantom limb of unlived potential reaches constantly for experiences we have never allowed ourselves to have. It gestures toward conversations we have never engaged in, relationships we have never risked, creative projects we have never begun, adventures we have never embarked upon. The hand that was never formed continues to grasp for a life that was never lived. And in that reaching, we feel the full weight of our own mortality, not of the body but of possibility itself. We begin to understand that time is not infinite, that the window for certain expressions of our authentic self grows smaller with each passing year. The young person who dreamed of writing poetry, of traveling to distant lands, of falling recklessly in love, of changing the world through the sheer force of their passion. Where did they go? When did we agree to trade the fullness of potential for the security of the known and manageable? Yet in this recognition lies the seed of our liberation. The phantom pain is not merely a source of suffering, but a call to action, a summons from the unlived aspects of ourselves that refuse to remain buried forever. It is the knock at the door of our carefully ordered existence, the voice that will not be silenced no matter how many times we explain why it is too late, too impractical, too risky to listen. The people around us often cannot see this phantom limb, cannot understand the nature of our ache. They see the life we have built, the career, the relationships, the achievements, and wonder why we seem so restless, so dissatisfied with what appears to be a perfectly adequate existence. But they cannot see the ghost that walks beside us, the shadow of who we might have been if we had been braver, more trusting of our own nature, more willing to disappoint others in order to remain true to ourselves. This is the spiritual fatigue that comes from being less than we are, from compressing our vast potential into forms that society can recognize and reward. We are like stars that have agreed to shine only as brightly as candles, like oceans that have consented to be contained in teacups. The effort required to maintain this diminishment is enormous, and eventually the soul rebels against the exhausting project of its own containment. In the quiet moments between one obligation and the next, we feel the phantom limb stirring, reaching, grasping for something we cannot quite name. It is the part of us that never agreed to the compromises we have made, the aspect of our being that remains forever young, forever ready to risk everything for the sake of authentic expression. This limb remembers what it felt like to be alive with possibility, when every door seemed to lead to adventure, when our future felt as vast and untamed as the night sky. The phantom pain teaches us that the unlived life is not simply absence, but presence, a constant reminder of what remains possible even now, even at this late hour. It whispers that it is never too late to honor the authentic impulses we have spent so much energy suppressing, never too late to give form to the dreams that have waited patiently in the shadows of our consciousness. As we learn to listen to this pain rather than numb it, we discover that it carries within it not just longing but instruction, guidance about how to begin living more authentically, even within the constraints of the life we have already built. The phantom limb may never fully materialize, but it can teach the real hands how to reach for what truly matters, how to grasp the opportunities for genuine expression that remain available to us. And here, in this deepest recognition of our spiritual exhaustion, we discover the most profound paradox of all, that what we have been calling weakness is actually the soul's ancient wisdom, calling us toward the most necessary death we will ever die. This is not the death of the body, but the death of all the false selves we have constructed, all the masks we have worn, all the stories we have told ourselves about who we must be to deserve love, success, safety, meaning. Like the caterpillar that reaches the end of its earthbound existence and begins the mysterious process of dissolution, you have arrived at the threshold of metamorphosis. But unlike the fairy tales would have us believe, this transformation is not a gentle unfolding of wings. It is a complete liquefaction of everything you thought you were, a dissolving into primordial soup so complete that no trace of your former self remains recognizable. The sacred rest that calls to you now is not the rest of vacation or recuperation, not the pause between activities or the respite from labor. This is the rest of the chrysalis, the profound stillness of complete surrender to forces beyond your conscious control, the willingness to let yourself dissolve so thoroughly that you can no longer distinguish between dreamer and dream, between self and cosmos, between what you were and what you are becoming. Your spiritual fatigue signals not an ending, but a beginning, the beginning of the most courageous journey you will ever undertake. For it takes more courage to stop than to keep going, more strength to surrender than to persist, more wisdom to dissolve than to maintain the familiar boundaries of selfhood that have kept you feeling separate from the mystery that you are. In the quiet darkness of this chrysalis moment, wrapped in the silk of your own willingness to not know, you begin to remember something that the world made you forget. Before you learned your name, before you absorbed the expectations of family and culture, before you constructed the elaborate persona that would protect you from rejection and ensure your survival in the social world. Who were you then? This remembering cannot be forced or hurried. It unfolds in its own time, like the slow recognition of a face glimpsed in a dream. The exhaustion you feel is not emptiness but fullness, the overwhelming fullness of your own authentic nature, pressing against the constraints of false identity, demanding space to breathe, to be, to express itself without the filters of should and must and need to. The alchemists knew this territory well. This phase they called the Nigredo, the blackening, the putrefaction, the necessary rotting away of all that is not essential. They understood that gold cannot be transmuted from base metals without first reducing everything to its most fundamental elements, without first destroying the existing forms so completely that only pure essence remains. You are in your Nigredo now, your sacred decomposition. Everything that once seemed solid about your identity is becoming fluid. The roles you have played, the achievements you have accumulated, the relationships you have defined yourself through, all of it is dissolving in the alchemical bath of exhaustion, revealing itself to be costume rather than skin, performance rather than truth. But this dissolution is not destruction, it is purification, like a river that must sometimes flood its banks to clear away the debris that has accumulated over seasons of ordinary flow. Your psyche is overflowing its familiar boundaries, washing away everything that has been preventing your deeper currents from finding their natural course. In this chrysalis of sacred rest, time moves differently. Minutes stretch into eternities, hours collapse into moments. The urgency that has driven your life for so long gives way to something more cyclical, more organic, the rhythm of breath, of heartbeat, of seasons turning within seasons. You begin to understand that rushing was always the enemy of arriving, that striving was always the obstacle to receiving, that becoming was always the barrier to being. The rest you crave is not the absence of activity, but the presence of deep alignment, the profound peace that comes when you stop swimming against the current of your own nature and allow yourself to be carried by forces that know your destination better than your conscious mind ever could. This is the rest of the seed in winter soil, pregnant with possibilities but content to wait in darkness until the moment of emergence arrives. Your exhaustion is your cocoon, spun from threads of every disappointment, every moment of feeling lost, every recognition that the path you were following was leading away from rather than toward your authentic home. This cocoon is not prison but sanctuary, not punishment but protection, the sacred space where transformation can occur without interference from the world's demands or your own impatience. Within this crystalline quiet, something miraculous begins to happen. The boundaries between inner and outer, between self and other, between human and divine, start to thin. You begin to sense yourself as part of something larger, more mysterious, more beautiful than the isolated individual you thought you were. The exhaustion that felt like ending reveals itself as opening, an opening into the vast spaciousness of your own deeper nature. This is the courage the chrysalis requires, not the courage of action, but the courage of allowing, not the strength of doing, but the strength of being done unto, not the wisdom of knowing, but the wisdom of trusting the unknown. You must be willing to become nothing in order to become everything, to lose yourself completely in order to find yourself truly. The sacred rest is calling you home, not to the home of your birth or your achievements or your relationships, but to the home of your essence, the place you have never left, though you have spent a lifetime forgetting its address. This home is not a destination you can reach through effort, but a recognition you can only receive through surrender. In the chrysalis of sacred rest, you are remembering who you were before the world told you who to be. Not the child you once were, but the eternal self that wore childhood like a costume, that has worn every role and relationship and achievement like temporary clothing while remaining essentially unchanged, essentially whole, essentially perfect as you are. The metamorphosis has already begun. Trust the dissolution, trust the rest, trust the sacred process that knows how to transform exhaustion into enlightenment, weariness into wisdom, the ending of what you were into the beginning of what you have always been. In the quiet darkness of the chrysalis, wings are forming that you cannot yet imagine. Rest now and let the mystery of your own becoming unfold in its own perfect time.